after a year of military conflict, how do you state or how do you assess the state of the armed forces today?
Thank you, Miriam. Let me start with support of what's been said already by my colleagues, that the current conflict is still going on, and all the diplomatic and political efforts, economic sanctions has proved to be only partly successful, especially in order to produce immediate outcomes. And this conflict has no military solution. It's been widely accepted, recognized, and endlessly repeated even by the Kremlin in public. However, for the time being, the Ukraine's armed resistance seems to be the most effective deterrence against the Russian aggression. And Ukraine has succeeded, I believe, to destroy the main objectives of the Kremlin, to create so-called Novorossiya and land corridors from the Russian border to Moldova. As for the Ukrainian successes, I have to point out that Ukraine has been able to achieve, I think, these great results due to at least three main factors. First, this is the Ukrainian society, which showed its maturity, its responsibility and readiness to defend the country. Second, it's Ukraine military that also proved to be really loyal to their country, to their people, not to the regime. And despite all the problems that you mentioned about Russian infiltration in the Ukrainian armed forces and security structures, in a very short time, Ukrainian military and Ukrainian security services started to provide real service to the Ukrainian people. And last but not the least, Ukraine would not be able to sustain without international partners. First of all, the United States and the European Union, and I wouldn't mention, but some Ukrainian neighbors in particular. Diplomatic, political, economic support, despite there are many critiques that was too late, too little, should not be underestimated when we consider the prospects of future the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. My next point, that the Ukrainian society has become an important factor not only in Ukrainian internal politics, but also a factor that should be properly accounted by international partners. And the Ukrainian volunteer movement, its scale, variety, is something that even surprised us as the Ukrainians, because it was like a common approach that Ukrainian saying, my house is the outskirt and I don't care, my хата с краю. So the Ukrainian society proved to be much more mature and responsible for the events and for their own future and the future of the country. As for the Ukrainian military, it appeared absolutely unprepared at the beginning of the conflict in March 2014. According to official reports of the Ukrainian acting Ministry of Defense at that time, 6,000 troops out of 120,000 were conditionally ready to defend the country. And if we consider the initial state of the Ukrainian military and their ability to fight Russian aggression on both fronts, just in very short time, in 2 or 3 months, I would say that this is a considerable progress. It's huge progress, but still too far from the success story. And the main problems remain, just to name a few, is the command and control system, coordination inside the Ukrainian army and between the different security structures, logistics. So this is just few to mention that real challenges that face Ukrainian reformers. I have to say that real reforms are still to be launched. Current ongoing transformation regarding restructuring, manning, rearmament, it's rather should be seen as an immediate reaction to the current conflict than the long-time vision of what kind of model we need in our country to provide sufficient defense and national security. Also, Ukraine has almost completed its comprehensive security and defense review. It published already a national security strategy and a few more documents like military doctrine, programs of armed forces development, defense industry development are to be finished in 1 or 2 months' time. So it's too early now to analyze how proper these documents are, but I suppose we will see kind of strategic vision of our leadership where our security and defense sector should go. And Ukraine has its defense industry, I would say, well developed in compared to other countries. But we should keep in mind that Ukraine's defense industry is not, as it's sometimes called, a defense industrial complex. So it produces only limited number of weapons that Ukrainian army needs. My second point is that up until recently, Ukraine has had very, let's say, close cooperation with the Russian Federation, because both countries depended on spare parts and ready-to-use equipment. So basically, taking these two facts, I would say that Ukraine is able to produce some of the items, but it's not able to produce all the Ukrainian army needs. Now we, as I already mentioned, we are developing a program of development of the defense industry, and again, it's too early to make assessment what will be in this program. But I think that one of the particular challenges that we now are facing, that the defense industry already is getting order to produce more tanks, because we are able to produce tanks, to produce some APCs, and this kind of stuff, just because, I think, not because we really need it for the current conflict and for the future, just because we have the capability. And I think that this can be a challenge for the future development, because once you buy an equipment, you have to maintain it and spend money, and lacking resources, you will not have money either to launch production or to buy it on the market. Just one small comment about the prospects and problems of the Minsk agreement. I was inspired by this Minsk II and wrote a short article to Kyiv Post, which is called Putin's Dogs. And there was a story about one of the first meetings hosted by Mr. Putin, and Angela Merkel was in his residence, and suddenly the Connie Labrador walked in the room, and Merkel, everybody knows, she does not, to put it softly, like dogs, and she was scared, a bit disappointed what was the signal and how this dog, how much freedom he has to walk in the room where 2 liters sit. And my point is that this situation reminds me when you are threatened by your neighbor with his dogs, and then the owner of the dogs insists that you have to make an agreement with the dogs. So I think this is the key problem, because it doesn't matter how hard you try to please the dogs, to feed them. As soon as they got them, they will do what they are trained to. The delay of publishing the results of the investigation. From the information I know from different sources, that the issue of how it's been shut down is almost 100% clear. but the concern is that the arguments must be as strong as to not allow to any counter-arguments for the other side. My second point is that why the Ukrainian air controllers did not ban or did not close the airspace. I think you actually touched very important issue about the exchange of information. And having said that many European capitals had the information about the presence of such air defense system on the ground doesn't mean that the people who cleared the aircraft for takeoff knew this information on their bosses. And I think it's one of the issues that should be also mentioned and measures developed. Also, as a former pilot and air traffic controller, I can tell you that I've been in constant contact with my colleagues, my former subordinates, and before the MH17 accident, all the aircraft, Ukrainian military aircraft, were shut down up to 6.5 kilometers altitude. And this one flew far above this altitude, about 12 kilometers. And also, it would be interesting, perhaps, that one of the Ukrainian fighter aircraft was shot down by the Russian aircraft, similar MiG-29, from the Russian territory. And this aircraft could fly even up to 20 kilometers. So, I mean, the altitude, I mean, the danger was there. And as my air defense colleague can tell you, that some of the Russian systems have range about 400 kilometers. That's, I mean, the Turkey should also probably worry about this. And one question I think that nobody touched so far is about Putin plans and possible threat for NATO countries and red lines. The information sharing is one of the issues being widely discussed among NATO members. And another issue which has been also discussed is the value of Article 5 of Washington Treaty, because all the actions done by Putin in Crimea, they are below the response of the Article 5. So the discussion is about elaborating, putting more details, and so on. But the problem is not actually in the wording of the article, but in the willingness to implement this article by the decision makers. And if we consider possible scenarios of how Putin can violate NATO borders, I don't think that he will repeat something similar to what's been done in Crimea, Georgia, or the east of Ukraine. I think there will be possibly a target chosen, very minor, I mean, insignificant from the point of view of national territory or assets or whatever, but just to show that NATO is not willing to implement its Article 5, and actually this is the basis of the NATO and who is going to trust NATO as a collective defense and security system.